Today I am with Bob Purvis. Bob has been growing fruit trees for the better part of the last, 40 years in Alaska, Minnesota, Idaho, even some warmer areas like Washington. And he is a treasure trove of information, knowledge, wisdom. He's got the tactics that you can employ, especially in a cold climate, when it comes to growing fruit trees. So stay tuned because this is going to be a good one. So you spent some time in Alaska and you're quite familiar with interior Alaska, so Fairbanks, where it can get extremely cold. I mean, that's one of the colder parts of the whole state. And
Yes.
let's start there as our kind of our litmus test. And that actually also serves as a test for growers in other areas that aren't quite as cold. So we're kind of defaulting to the lowest common denominator by focusing overwhelmingly on the Fairbanks area. Does that sound like a good idea?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what were some of the biggest issues that you saw and currently see when it comes to growing fruit trees in a cold area, particularly like Fairbanks?
Well, I think probably one of the very first things is choosing. Uh, I know that in Fairbanks, within the city limits itself, growing fruit trees was very, very difficult because cold air would puddle there. But if you went up to like 600 to 1,200 feet elevation around Fairbanks, that was where people who were growing apples and apple crabs and crab apples had the greatest success.
Because they're slightly out of the frost.
That's right. Yes.
Better air drainage.
Yes, that's right. And they were having the best success with edible crab apples, apple crabs, and short season apples, and also with plants such as nanking cherries or Manchurian plums. And besides the actual cold itself, cold soils is another issue because the area of biological activity in the soil up there is probably only a few inches, and the hope is that you don't have permafrost underneath the soil. Another thing that I learned from talking with a man in Big Delta or Delta Junction, Alaska, is that wind can be almost as big of a factor in damaging or killing fruit trees up there as sheer cold, because wind will desiccate or dry out the leaf buds and flower buds. So that being the case, you would need to do things like plant like a shelter belt or a windbreak of some kind, or maybe plant your trees in the lee of a house.
And then what could growers use as a shelter belt? Things like Siberian pea shrub or...
Yeah, Siberian pea shrub or Siberian crabapple, willows or alders, maybe poplars would also work, or spruce.
Great.
And the other thing is there are a few advantages, and that is that the interior is warmer than the coastal regions of Alaska, and also up in Fairbanks you have about 21 hours or more, maybe 21 hours and 3/4 of sun on the longest day of the year, and this tends to offset to some degree the short growing season. And the other thing is that the temperatures in June, July, and early August are warm enough that you're coming up close to the best temperatures for photosynthesis. Another thing is, shall I talk about rootstocks, or shall I say a little more about the soils?
You could talk a little bit more about soils, then we'll jump into
Okay.
rootstocks.
All right. The breakdown of organic matter in these cold soils is going to be slow. So if you want to make compost, you might want to gather your materials and put them in a garage or a basement to speed up the process. And the other thing there would be you need to have, I think we said this before, about good cold air and water drainage. You don't want to be growing fruit trees in soils that are poorly drained. And most Alaskan soils are rather acidic, so you need to have a soil test and finding out just how acidic the soils are and how much lime you might need to apply. So I think that's about all I can say about the soil and wind and water issues there.
Sounds good. And any things to consider for when people are physically planting the trees themselves?
Yes, I think an important thing would be the soils are going to be warmest close to the surface, and they're going to be getting progressively colder as you go down deeper. So you want to be sure and spread the roots of your trees to go laterally as much as you can, as opposed to trying to dig a narrow, deep hole. That would be a mistake. And I know recent research, even in temperate climates, shows that it's better with most fruit trees to spread the roots out and let them go laterally rather than having them try and go deeply. About 70% of the root mass in the temperate zone is in the top foot and about 20% in the second foot of soil and about 10% in the third foot. So for that reason, you can see how important it would be to make sure that you have a lot of roots in the top foot.
All right, great. Now, let's talk a little bit about rootstock, right? Rootstocks. Give a brief intro on rootstocks.
Okay.
What are they? How much influence they have on the rest of the plant? Why they're important, and then we'll go over specific varieties at the end.
Yeah, rootstocks are basically 1 or 2 year old plants that are grown specifically for their properties of disease resistance or size control of what's grafted onto them or cold hardiness. And for apple, Siberian crabapple would be the first choice, Renetka crabapple and Dolga crab probably the second choice. There's no known incompatibilities between Dolgo and any apple or crabapple grafted to it. But with Siberian crab, there's been conflicting reports from different people about what's compatible with it. And I think the safest thing I could say about compatibility is that if an apple has a crabapple somewhere in its ancestry, there's not much chance of incompatibility. But if it's a purely domestic apple, there may be some issues. And for pear, Pyrus usuriensis, the Usurian pear seedling, would be the choice. Common pear seedling or even the Old Home by Farmingdale series would not make it in the interior.
But OHXF series may make it in, say,
in South Central
Alaska,
I think
Southeast
that's a safe
Alaska.
bet.
Okay.
Yes. And then for cherry trees, I think that the best we have for grafting onto is probably Mahaleb. Mahaleb has fewer roots, but they go much deeper, and it's both more cold tolerant and drought tolerant than Mazard. And the only warning there is Mahaleb does not tolerate wet or waterlogged soils. It'll die fairly quickly in those soils.
Now in Montana, we've had some better luck with the Gisela series in parts of the state over Mazard. Do you have anything to say about that?
My experience in Minnesota was that Gisela 7 was adequately winter hardy outside of the Twin Cities. We had a black gold sweet cherry on Gisela 7, and there was never any winter injury to the root system of the tree, even in a snowless winter. We had a good cherry crop after that.
Okay.
And it bloomed on time.
Anything you could say about Krimsk for cherries?
Yes, I know that in Alaska, Krimsk 5 is looking promising, and it is somewhat dwarfing. And I know that like Krimsk 1 is a good rootstock for plums, but Fred Deiser in the Matanuska Valley found that there's a yellow plum from Anchorage with poor quality fruit that if used as an interstem will impart much better vigor and much earlier bearing and heavier bearing to European plums that are grafted to it.
Yeah, I've talked with Fred about that, and I found that quite interesting, and he actually recommended Mustang.
Yes, and Mustang, if you were in Canada, would be an excellent rootstock. It's hardy in Zone 2, USDA, but getting Mustang in the U.S. right now is next to impossible.
You have to get it tissue cultured from Canada.
That's right, yeah.
Now, we're kind of jumping around between cherries and plums, but I guess since we've kind of segued to plums, we've had good luck grafting, particularly Krimsk 86, grafting plums onto Krimsk 86. Could you report anything about Alaskan growers with that rootstock, particularly for plums?
Quite frankly, I don't know if anybody in Alaska has used Krimsk 86, but I think that given its qualities of good anchorage, tolerance of wet soils and saline soils, and cold, that Krimsk 86, coming as it is from Russia, would be an excellent one to trial up there. And I haven't talked to any growers up there who have used it, but I would certainly recommend it. And Krimsk 86 here has worked very well in plums. It's worked well on some of our peaches. It's worked well on some of our apricots with very little suckering in most cases.
Yeah. I mean, we like it because of just the take rate when it comes to Asian American hybrid plums as well as European plums. Do you have any other recommendations when it comes to a plum rootstock?
Well, I think American plum, even though that would seem like a logical choice, might be a poor choice because of lack of vigor.
Yeah.
That's what Fred Deiser was saying.
I was amazed to see how vigorous some of your Native American plum, not that vigorous, relatively speaking, but much more vigorous than we've seen in Montana.
Yeah, maybe because our soils are warmer and drier than Montana's. It's kind of hard to say.
Yeah.
Manchurian plum, if you can find it, would be an excellent rootstock that's more vigorous.
Yeah.
And it also, surprisingly, is compatible with both European and Asian plums.
Sure.
And hybrids.
Okay, so what next? We could probably talk about apricot rootstock. I mean, I know that apricots are probably somewhat marginal in Fairbanks, but perhaps if they're, like you said, in the surrounding hills, they might be able to grow a few. So what are the rootstocks for apricots? We
The
won't talk
the
about varieties yet. We'll just talk about rootstocks,
Yeah, I
but
think Manchurian apricot seedling would be my choice.
probably the only go-to, huh?
That's right. And if I may, as an aside here, I'll say that in northern Mongolia,
Yeah.
uh, Siberian apricot, which is the trees are not very tall. It imparted good vigor to the prairie province apricots grafted to it, but I don't think anybody can get a hold of that easily from most nurseries here in the States.
Okay. All right. So what else? What else? Anything else we should
I think
cover?
that's about all I can say about the interior.
I would probably say if there's anything in the way of peaches that people would want to grow, I mean, they would have to be in a reasonable spot where it wouldn't get any colder than say minus 38, because what we've found is that the only peach that could survive at that temperature would be that Siberian sea peach.
Yes, that's right.
And you could probably guess what rootstock I would recommend for that one, huh?
Yeah, Siberian sea seedling.
Well, the Siberian sea seedling,
Or
but if you were going to graft it, yeah.
Yep, or Krimsk 86 maybe.
Yeah, I've had better luck with Manchurian actually.
Oh, that's right. I remember we talked about that earlier.
Peach on Manchurian, and,
Yeah.
and it seems to the take rate is actually really good, and I'm amazed at the vigor. So,
Right.
anything else? So we've covered apple, apple crab, crabapple, pear, peach, plum, cherry. Anything else?
No, but I might just say that, well, I'll talk about rootstocks for South Central Alaska after this.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Do you want to talk about rootstocks for South Central Alaska?
Yeah, I was going to say here that we have a plum, or excuse me, an apricot out there in the orchard, the Precious from Ontario province, from a ski resort there. And I think that from what I've seen, that the seedlings of Precious would make excellent rootstocks for apricots in South Central.
Interesting. Huh.
They would tolerate cold, wet soils like you would have up in the interior part of Ontario.
Okay.
And
I was taken aback this summer when I tried that Precious. I thought it was after Zard. I thought that was my favorite tasting of the cold hardy apricots.
excuse me. Yeah, Precious only disadvantage here is it's relatively small, like about maybe 1.1 inches in diameter, but the flavor is good, and the kernel in the pit is edible. It's like an almond.
Okay. All right. So we've talked about anything else you want to add about rootstocks for
No,
South Central?
that's
Okay.
it.
All right. Should we dive into varieties of these given fruits? Is that where we're at?
Well, actually, I was going to talk about some of the cultural considerations there in South Central Alaska.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. The biggest issue there, and this would certainly be true in Scandinavia or England, is lack of heat units. And this means that growing peaches outside of a greenhouse is essentially impossible. And to compensate for this, generally speaking, you want to pick fruit cultivars that come, if possible, from a maritime or a modified maritime climate like Scandinavia, or maybe parts of Canada. Things that grow in the interior, especially the stone fruits, may not ripen in the short summers there in South Central. And the other thing too is that why not peaches? Well, it's because their wood will not harden off properly in the short summers with a lack of heat units. And then even if temperatures only went down to like 0 or minus 10 in the winter, you would have winter injury. And since peaches bear on the previous season's wood, you would lose your crop because of that. And deep freezing of the ground can be a serious issue if there's a snowless winter, like the winter of 1986-87 in Anchorage, or 2005-2006 in Minnesota. And this is why using peach as a rootstock for apricots or plums is a big mistake, and something I regret to say that some nurseries are using that in the Midwest where they shouldn't be doing that.
Interesting.
And in terms of sites, the more sun you get on the site, of course, the better. Like at least 6 hours of direct sun, 8 or 10 would be far better. So a slope to the west or the southwest, like my yard in Anchorage, or to the south would be ideal. Southeast would be okay. North would definitely be a big no-no for Alaska. And the other thing too is that growing fruit trees on flat ground, you're going to have serious issues with both cold air drainage and water drainage, and as a result, you'll have more problems with frost. So, no commercial grower in the lower 48 would grow apple trees or fruit trees on absolutely flat ground, unless there was some mitigating factor that would make it possible, but I would say most would not. And if you looked at the orchards, the apple orchards in Washington State, you'd find that generally they place them on sloping ground.
Sure. Now, for everything that you're saying, for our listeners and our viewers, how much of this can be extrapolated to the coldest areas in North America?
I would say a lot of it. I think wind issues are going to be a major factor in Montana or the Dakotas or Minnesota, maybe less so in Wisconsin and Maine. And that means, of course, staking trees after they're planted. That's a very important cultural technique.
Sure.
And also guarding your trees against, in Alaska, we had to guard them against moose. In the northern plains states, you would probably have to guard them against deer. And an 8-foot fence would most likely stop a mule deer like we have here in Idaho, but you would need at least a 10-foot fence to keep whitetails from jumping over it and getting into the...
Yeah.
I know that deer depredation on fruit trees has been a very serious issue in the upper Midwest, especially in recent years.
Rats with hooves, as they say.
Yes.
All right, well, is there anything else you want to cover before we go into specific cultivars?
Yes, I would say that people who own dogs should know that dogs will chew or gnaw on fruit trees, especially on the trunks.
Okay.
So you need to do something like perhaps put a spiral plastic arbor guard around the tree. And although we would normally paint the trunks of trees with white latex paint, there might be something to be said for putting arbor guards on a young tree and then taking them off in the spring so that the bark can warm up more quickly.
Sure.
Like in May or June.
The plastic spirals seem to be the easiest in terms of just...
Yes, I've used those a lot in the past 30 years.
They're quick to put on, they're not too expensive, and they're durable.
And the other thing is, with voles being a problem in a lot of areas, including right here in Idaho, but also in Alaska, putting out, like putting bait underground or putting hardware mesh around the trunks of the trees would be an important cultural practice. And that also would prevent rabbits from gnawing on the bark. And you might want to put it up several feet, at least several feet. And at the same time, Luke, I would recommend trying as quickly as possible to get the trees to branch out higher above the ground in like 3 or 4 feet so they won't be in the snow where they could be damaged by rabbits. And one last comment, if I may. The soils in Alaska oftentimes being sandy or gravelly or even rocky as opposed to being loam. One of the problems to be aware of is that those soils will not hold certain nutrients very well, specifically nitrates and phosphates and sulfates and borates. So it would be a smart idea for anybody who wants to plant fruit trees in Alaska or Montana or anywhere else to take a soil test and send it to a laboratory that is accustomed to testing soils from your local area.
What do you have to say about getting actually tissue analyses done?
Well, the best time to do leaf analysis on fruit trees is typically on stone fruits shortly after harvest. And I think that for northern areas, late July would be generally probably the best time because fruit trees are most depleted of nutrients right after harvest.
Yeah. I know that John Kempf is a big proponent of sap analyses. Have you heard of this?
Yes, it's a new technique. It's been around for about 5 years or so, and I myself haven't used it, but I've been encouraged to submit leaf samples for sap analysis to see exactly what nutrients are actually in the tree itself as opposed to like in the leaves.
Yeah, and from my understanding, you can actually see which nutrients are being chelated.
That may well be true, but I can't say that for sure from experience.
Yeah, neither can I. It's just an interesting point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, so now to the fun part. Not that this hasn't been fun, but I'm sure people want to learn a little bit about various cultivated varieties, aka cultivars, of these cold hardy fruit trees. All right, so let's start with apples. And I'm talking about domesticated apples. These are apples that, mainly have the overwhelming majority of their genetics as Malus domestica. So you don't have as much of the crab in their genetics.
Right.
And so we'll talk about apple crabs and crabs after this. So
okay.
Take it away, Bob.
All right. One last comment.
Yeah.
If you're growing apples or any other fruits in a northerly climate, you need vigorous rootstocks to compensate for the short growing season
Sure.
and the lack of heat units. And
So that's where that Dolgo comes in.
Yes.
I'm a fan of Dolgo.
Yeah,
but-
Dolgo is 110% the vigor of domestic apple seedlings, so that makes it an excellent choice. And Dolgo fruits are actually fairly good in Fairbanks. They tend to be kind of tart in Anchorage. Carroll would be a really good choice for Fairbanks, likewise Parkland, likewise Norland, and any of the Nor series apples that were developed back in the 80s and 90s at Beaver Lodge, Alberta. They are specifically Nor Q, Nor Hay, Norette, Nor Sun, Nor Ann, Norda, and then later on they introduced Nor Bill and Nor Love.
And did you say Nor Kent?
And Nor Kent as well. And Nor Kent has done very well in Kenai, Alaska, and Nor Kent has survived temperatures down to about minus 47 or minus 48 in Bozeman, Montana. So we have there those three, or actually it's about 8. We also have September Ruby, which was developed in Canada and has grown well in Bozeman, Montana. And we also have Prairie Sensation, which has done well in the Madawaska Valley. And we have Higher 12, which is very, very hardy from Canada, from the prairies.
All right, we're back. All right, we had some technical difficulties. So, Bob, try to pick up where you left off.
Okay, I mentioned Dearborn's Unknown, an apple that somewhat resembles Norland, but in a warm location it was far more heat tolerant than Norland, and the quality is very good. Also, Yellow Transparent, it's been around for a long time in Alaska. Oriole, which is half yellow transparent in its ancestry, and Mantet, and most of these would do well in either Fairbanks or Anchorage.
Okay, great. Now, what about frostbite?
Yes, frostbite. The question which frostbite remains to be proven for will it ripen in the growing season there in Anchorage, and I think the answer is yes, but I know that frostbite has proven to be cold hardy down to about minus 48 in Bozeman, Montana, and as such it deserves to be tried on the hills around Fairbanks. Apple crabs are a cross of a domestic apple with a crabapple. So some of the ones we have here, one of the most noteworthy is Kerr, cross of Dolgo crab by Harrelson. We also have Trail Man, which is a sweet apple crab that's very hardy and high quality. Trail Man is a cross of the trail apple with the Osmond crab. And its parents are mediocre, but Trail Man itself is far better than either parent. We have Centennial crabapple, which is sweet. And we also have chestnut crab, which they use in Minnesota as a pollinizer in the orchards.
Now, you're colloquially calling these but they're apple crabs.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Based on the size of the fruit, which typically runs around 2 inches or so.
Yeah. All right, great. Now, what about any pure crab apples?
Oh, I think Dolga would be the only one that comes immediately to my mind.
Okay. Any sweet cherries you grow, I would stick to Gold and Lapins, and that's only if you don't see anything below minus 35, maybe minus 38.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Black Gold is hardy to at least minus 33, maybe minus 35.
Yeah, we've found that Lapins, at least in our experience, has been much more reliable than Black Gold or White Gold. What about the Romance series?
We've got the Romance series from Canada, like Valentine is one of the very best. Juliet is good also. They have survived for you there in Montana, I believe, haven't they?
Yeah.
And they've survived pretty well up in the Madawaska Valley in Alaska as well. I don't know how they've done in Fairbanks.
Okay. But nankings would do well there.
Yes, nanking cherry seedlings. The fruits are relatively small, but they taste like a cross between a sweet and a tart cherry.
Yeah.
And they make excellent jelly.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And they're very, very productive. And in terms of the standard tart cherries, North Star, Meteor, and Misabi are 3 that I've had experience with. The Meteor is hardy throughout Zone 3, maybe the warmest parts of Zone 2. Danube and Montmorency are 2 tender for growing in south central Alaska, and they certainly would never make it in Fairbanks.
All right, apricots, Bob.
Okay. The most cold hardy apricot that we currently can get a hold of is Sunrise. And Sunrise has borne reliably in Saskatchewan for probably close to 50 years. So I think we could say it's hardy to minus 50, maybe slightly. And then the next most cold hardy would be Brookcott. And very close to that also would be Westcott. These have both survived minus 40 8 in northern Minnesota, and then just very almost as good as Debbie's Gold, and then not quite as good, but still of high quality, is Morton 604, which I think can take down to about -40 to -45. And once we get out of that range there, there's a few others, for example, like Strathmore, which is I believe it's out of Alberta. One that I should mention here, which might be worth a try in the interior, is Zard. Zard has survived -41 Fahrenheit in southwest Minnesota without damage. And it's late blooming, and it takes a lot of heat units to break dormancy, so it would probably be a good choice only in the interior. I don't think it would really work very well in South Central.
All right, and then what about Precious?
Oh yes, and Precious would be an excellent choice for anchorage. But what we found was that in Minnesota, the apricots and plums and apples and pears that were hardy in extreme upstate New York, near the Canadian border, were about a half a zone less hardy in southwest Minnesota. But possibly that could be due to the lower humidity there, and also the fact that that site was very windy, like average annual speed of wind of about 16 miles an hour.
I don't think you mentioned hardy Iowa yet.
No, that's one that came naturally from Iowa. And I've fruited hardy Iowa here in Idaho, and I was impressed with the quality of the fruit. It certainly is every bit as good as Debbie's Gold or Morton 604. Size is about the same. It's borne, the tree I have is in a frosty location, so it's not borne too much fruit, but I think it would be worth a try in South Central and possibly even in the interior.
And then lastly, Manchurian apricot, right?
Yes.
Wouldn't you, especially for those in Fairbanks who may only be relegated to sunrise potentially, you just encourage them to try to grow some Manchurian seedlings?
That's right. And there's a man named Al Precht in western Minnesota who's been selecting Manchurian apricots. And one of the very best that he found was Wayne. He named these after his buddies in his unit in Vietnam who were killed. And Wayne was named after one of them. And I have a bearing tree of Wayne here, and Wayne's claim to fame, besides good fruit quality, is that it bore a crop of apricots after a record-breaking mid-May frost in central Minnesota.
Plums.
Yes, okay.
Asian American hybrids first.
Okay. The earliest ripening ones are La Crescent and Underwood and Pembina, and also Petitson number 5, which is out of Manchuria. And also Zapi is fairly early. That's out of Poland originally.
And that's a Manchurian plum selection, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I've only heard about it.
Yeah, Manchurian plums, if you can get the seedling Manchurian plums as opposed to American, Manchurian plums in Alaska generally had, the fruits weren't real large, but they were generally sweet, and the skins were not unduly tart, which is not true with American plums.
Sure. And so that's, of course, not an Asian American hybrid. That's just an Asian plum, but not of the same genetic line as like the Asian plums that like, for instance, like elephant, heart.
Yeah, elephant heart, for example.
Yeah.
And a few other plums that are noteworthy. Brook Gold has been reliably hardy in both Canada and northern Mongolia, which is saying a lot. And also Brook Red. Those are Canadian introductions. And Toka is a master pollinizer of American or Japanese-American hybrid plums, the Asian plums. And the other plum I need to mention here, although it might ripen too late, it's a later blooming plum called South Dakota. South Dakota has an extended bloom period, so it's a great pollinizer for all plums.
Okay.
And I have it here.
That's great. All right. Any other Asian American hybrids before we move on to European?
I would mention briefly Assiniboine, which the only drawback is it's extremely winter hardy. Probably below -50, but the fruit quality is only mediocre, but you could certainly use it for jam and jelly, if not for fresh eating.
Sure. All right, what about European plums?
Okay, for the interior, I think Northern Blue would be worth a try. And I think that for South Central Alaska, Mount Royal, Northern Blue, and especially Opal. Opal is from Sweden, and it ripens about Labor Day in Anchorage.
So you wouldn't put Mount Royal and Northern Blue at the same hardiness? Even though Northern Blue's a seedling selection of Mount Royal?
I think that they're probably about the same hardiness, but they've never been tried side by side in Alaska that I'm aware of.
Okay. So how come you're recommending Northern Blue over Mount Royal?
Because it ripens quite early in the season. It ripens a few days after Opal, which would be like probably around September 5th or 7th there in Anchorage in a typical summer.
Okay, got it.
But opal is not hardy much below minus 35, so it's not recommended for the interior. On pears, I think for the interior, about the only ones that you would have much success with would be Hudar from New York State and Summercrisp from Minnesota. And there's a few Russian pears like
Krasulia.
Krasulia.
And you know what that means in Russian, right?
Beautiful?
Yeah.
Okay, and then...
Beauty, I've heard.
Is it Larinskaya?
Larinskaya.
Yeah, okay. And then the Apostle Series pears like John and a few others, their quality isn't very good. Golden Spice is slightly better.
But those are all Usuriensis selections,
yes,
right?
They are.
And very hardy.
And then the Ur pear is quite hardy, and the fruit quality is pretty decent, and it's hardy probably to at least minus 46. And it ripens about mid-season, I think, in Alaska. And then, the other one is Stacy, which ripens early, and it's survived for about, I think, close to 300 years in Maine. If we move to south central Alaska, Hudar and Summercrisp again, I think Burr Giffard, which is very early ripening, is worth a try. And Clara Frise has survived minus 40 in southwest Minnesota. And once again, Stacy. But I think the big issue with pears in south central is the heat unit situation. Maybe another situation is that the soils may not be heavy enough for pears to really thrive. I think I went through the list there. I don't really have much more to say about pears, except that the growing season in Anchorage and south central is lengthened by at least a couple weeks in the past 30 years or so.
Okay.
And they've had warmer temperatures too.
Sure. All right, so there you have it. Some growing tips, especially in a cold climate, here with Bob Purvis. Bob, any final thoughts?
No, I think we've wrapped it up pretty well.
We've wrapped it up, and there you have it.